At 75, Margaret had long believed she understood life. She had survived the death of a husband she had adored, raised 2 children on her own, and navigated the small triumphs and disappointments that came with age. Her home, modest but warm, reflected a life built carefully over decades. Her garden bursting with seasonal blooms, photographs of family and friends lining the mantel, and the faint smell of vanilla and fresh bread always lingering in the kitchen. She had thought herself content, quietly enjoying the rhythm of her days. But contentment, she was learning, can be deceptive. The first hint of trouble came subtly. A letter from her bank mentioned an overdraft, which confused her. She had always been meticulous about her finances. Then came a call, polite at first, asking about discrepancies in her accounts. Margaret's heart sank as she listened, realizing that funds she had carefully saved over the years were missing. At first, she told herself it must be an error, something easily corrected. She called the bank repeatedly, reviewing statements with growing disbelief. And then she remembered the casual comment James had made weeks ago, at breakfast, brushing crumbs off his suit jacket. "Don't worry about the lawyer, Mom. I've got it all under control." Those words, meant to reassure, now rang like a bell of alarm. Something inside her tightened, a knot of suspicion, of betrayal. Margaret had known her children well enough to recognize the subtle hints of deceit. James's forced calm, Emily's flustered excuses, the way they both avoided looking her in the eye when money was mentioned. These were no longer coincidences. Her children, the very people she had devoted her life to, were siphoning her hard-earned savings. Margaret felt a wave of shock, quickly followed by a sharper pang of hurt. She had devoted decades to ensuring her children's comfort, never once asking for repayment, never once considering her sacrifice insufficient. She had tucked away birthdays and holidays, long nights spent comforting scraped knees or broken hearts, years spent making sure there was always enough for them. And now, at 75, she found that love had been repaid with opportunism and greed. But Margaret was not powerless. She had spent a lifetime handling crises, negotiating contracts, and managing the estate her late husband had left behind. She knew that the key was patience, observation, and strategy. She would not allow herself to be rushed or intimidated. She would not confront her children directly, for their arrogance could easily manipulate her emotions. Instead, she would act carefully, deliberately, with the precision of someone who understood the human heart and the law alike. That evening, Margaret sat by the window with her teacup, staring at the soft glow of the streetlights outside. The garden, which had always brought her solace, now seemed like a metaphor for her own life. Outwardly serene, yet beneath the surface roots tangled with deceit and danger. She began to consider her options, weighing each with care. It was not just money at stake. It was respect, dignity, and control over her own life. Margaret realized something profound in that quiet hour. Anger alone would not suffice. She needed patience. She needed foresight. And above all, she needed a plan that would leave no room for manipulation or regret. Slowly, the knot in her chest eased, replaced by determination. She would reclaim her life, not with shouting or confrontation, but with subtlety, intelligence, and timing. As she extinguished the candle on her nightstand, she whispered to herself, "They think I am weak. They think I cannot fight. But they do not know me." For the first time in weeks, sleep came peacefully. It was not fear that carried her to rest, but anticipation. Margaret had begun a quiet, deliberate journey of reclaiming what was hers. And deep inside, a spark of satisfaction flickered. She would not be betrayed without consequence. Margaret woke each morning with a renewed sense of purpose. Her house, once a sanctuary of gentle routine, had transformed into her command center. The kitchen table was covered with neatly organized documents, spreadsheets, and financial statements. She had begun the painstaking task of tracing every dollar, every withdrawal, every check that had been moved from her accounts. What had initially seemed like a minor oversight now revealed itself as a pattern of calculated deception. James, ever confident and charming, still carried himself with that self-assured arrogance, unaware that Margaret was quietly observing him. She noticed how he bragged to friends on the phone about his investments, name-dropping lawyers and charities he claimed to support. Each boast, each casual lie, gave her more insight into his character, and more threads she could use to protect herself. Emily, her younger daughter, was a different challenge. Impulsive, quick to panic, and always demanding. Margaret found that if she remained calm and collected, Emily's energy worked against her, making her reveal more than she intended. Margaret also began reaching out to old acquaintances, friends who had experience with estate law, financial planning, and investment oversight. She did so discreetly, never mentioning her children by name, but explaining that she wanted to secure her finances and ensure that no mistakes threatened her remaining years. Each phone call added to her arsenal. Practical advice, legal strategies, and confirmation that she was not powerless, that the law could be her shield as well as her weapon. The betrayal, Margaret realized, cut deeper than she had expected. It was not merely the theft of money, it was the erosion of trust. She had raised her children to value honesty, respect, and family bonds. To discover that they saw her as a resource, a convenience to be exploited, ignited a mixture of sadness and determination. She allowed herself the brief sting of hurt, then turned it into resolve. Anger without action was wasted energy. Strategy, however, could turn betrayal into power. Every evening, after meticulously documenting transactions, Margaret would sit by the fireplace with a cup of chamomile tea, reviewing her progress. She created charts, timelines, and detailed notes, connecting the dots of her children's schemes. She identified accounts, assets, and potential loopholes that could either be defended or leveraged. Each discovery strengthened her confidence. Margaret was not acting out of spite. She was acting to restore balance, to reclaim her life from those who had assumed they had control over it. Small, subtle moves became part of her strategy. A casual question about an account here, a gentle suggestion about taxes there. Nothing overt, nothing that would alert her children to her awareness. She wanted them to underestimate her, to assume that age and quietness equaled vulnerability. Every misstep they made in their greed, every boast or careless statement, became a piece of evidence she collected like a careful archivist. Margaret also spent time reflecting on herself, on the strength she had cultivated over decades. The hours of vigilance, the sacrifices, the patience required to raise children and manage a household alone. They were all tools she now wielded. She remembered her husband's advice. Observe first, act later. The quietest minds are often the most dangerous. She had never truly understood his words until now. By the end of the month, Margaret had created a detailed blueprint of her children's financial activities, including the weaknesses she could exploit and the assets she could protect. Her plan was not impulsive or vengeful. It was deliberate, measured, and precise. The betrayal had awakened a force within her, a combination of intelligence, patience, and quiet determination that would soon shift the balance of power in her favor. As she closed her ledger for the night, Margaret allowed herself a rare smile. The path ahead was clear, and for the first time since discovering the betrayal, she felt the steady, empowering pulse of control. Her children had underestimated her. But soon, very soon, that mistake would become their undoing. The day Margaret had been preparing for arrived quietly, without fanfare or announcement. The sun rose over her garden, casting golden light on roses she had nurtured for decades, a serene contrast to the storm she was about to unleash. She dressed carefully, choosing a blouse of soft cream and a cardigan that concealed nothing of the quiet authority radiating from her. Every detail mattered. Her posture, her expression, the calmness in her voice. Today she would confront her children, not with rage, but with precision. James had invited her to lunch at a nearby bistro, insisting on discussing matters face to face, with that same arrogant confidence he had always carried. Emily was tagging along, claiming she wanted to mediate the conversation. Margaret arrived punctually, greeting them with a gentle smile that belied the calculation in her mind. She observed them closely as they spoke. James tapping his fingers, trying to maintain composure. Emily fidgeting, her tone slightly too high, her eyes darting nervously. Everything was as she had predicted. James started with his usual charm offensive, attempting to downplay the situation. "Mom, don't worry about the lawyer," he said, the same line he had used weeks ago. He thought it would intimidate her, or reassure her. But Margaret merely smiled, a soft measured curve of her lips. "Of course," she replied lightly, as if the words held no weight. But they did. She had already set the wheels in motion: bank freezes, trust revisions, and carefully documented legal notices. Every financial thread James and Emily had believed they controlled was now out of their reach. As the meal progressed, Margaret listened, nodding politely while speaking just enough to maintain a veneer of civility. She allowed them to talk themselves into revealing more than they intended, their nervousness betraying them with every word. James mentioned a new investment fund he thought would go unnoticed. Emily admitted to transferring funds she borrowed from one account to another. Each admission, recorded discreetly in Margaret's mind, reinforced the inevitability of her plan. Then came the moment Margaret had been waiting for. She set down her fork, leaned slightly forward, and spoke in a calm, controlled voice that carried the weight of decades of experience. "You told me not to worry about the lawyer," she said, letting the words linger. "And that's exactly when I started doing it. And it wasn't in vain." The effect was immediate. James froze, a color draining from his face. Emily's mouth opened, then closed, as if she could not find words to respond. Margaret's eyes held theirs, unwavering and steady, the calm before the storm made manifest in human form. They had always underestimated her, believed her age, her quiet nature, and her gentle demeanor were signs of weakness. But Margaret had learned patience, strategy, and the subtle art of influence over decades. Their disbelief and panic were confirmation of her quiet power. What followed was swift and deliberate. Margaret laid out the legal framework she had prepared: documentation of fraudulent withdrawals, account freezes, and the reallocation of assets under trust. The documents, precise and airtight, left no room for argument. James and Emily, who had once considered her naive, were now forced to confront the consequences of their actions. They attempted to negotiate, plead, and charm, but every move had been anticipated and countered. Margaret had built a fortress of evidence, strategy, and foresight. For Margaret, the satisfaction was subtle yet profound. She did not relish their discomfort. Her triumph was in reclaiming her autonomy and dignity. She had turned betrayal into empowerment, proving that age and gentleness could conceal a formidable strength. Her children had treated her like a resource, but she had reminded them, silently, efficiently, irreversibly, that she was a person of her own authority, capable of defending what was rightfully hers. As the lunch concluded, Margaret walked away with her head held high, her heart calm, and her spirit unbroken. The turning point had come, and she had emerged not just victorious, but empowered. She had faced betrayal and transformed it into a catalyst for justice. And nothing, not even the arrogance of her own children, could take that away. The weeks following the confrontation were quiet, almost serene. Margaret returned to her home with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. The storm of betrayal had passed, leaving behind clarity, dignity, and control over her life. She walked through her garden, inhaling the fragrance of roses and jasmine, noting how each bloom seemed to symbolize resilience, thriving despite harsh weather and neglect, much like herself. Margaret had taken back not only her finances, but also her autonomy. Every bank account, every investment, every property that had been manipulated by James and Emily was now secured under her control. Legal measures were in place to prevent future exploitation, and the evidence she had meticulously gathered ensured that her children could not circumvent her decisions. But it was not revenge in the cruel sense that filled her heart. It was restoration of her dignity, her safety, and the quiet comfort that comes from knowing she was finally free from deceit. Her children, humbled and forced to reckon with the consequences of their actions, approached her cautiously. James's arrogance had been replaced by shame. Emily's impulsiveness had been tempered with uncertainty. They apologized, awkwardly and hesitantly, offering words that felt hollow yet familiar. Margaret listened patiently, acknowledging their words without rushing to forgive, without giving them false reassurance. She had learned that forgiveness was hers to give, on her own terms, and not because they demanded it. Margaret's life, once consumed with worry and betrayal, now opened up to opportunities she had long deferred. She began investing her reclaimed resources into passions she had set aside for decades: art classes, travel to places she had only dreamed of visiting, and charitable endeavors that reflected her values. She volunteered at local community centers, sharing her knowledge of gardening, finance, and resilience with younger generations, teaching lessons born not only of wisdom, but also of experience and heartbreak. The real reward, however, was subtle and deeply personal. Each morning, she woke without the heavy weight of anxiety pressing on her chest. Each evening, she sipped her tea on the porch, watching the sunset without fear of manipulation or disappointment. Her home, once a stage for deceit, had become a sanctuary again, a place of calm, reflection, and growth. Margaret's smile, once tinged with the sorrow of betrayal, now carried serenity and quiet pride. She reflected on her journey often, marveling at the irony of life. The children who had thought themselves clever, who had believed they could manipulate a gentle, elderly mother, had inadvertently awakened a force they could not comprehend. Margaret had been underestimated, dismissed, and betrayed, but that very underestimation had allowed her to act with precision, patience, and strategy. The lesson was clear: age is not weakness, and experience is a weapon in disguise. One afternoon, as she pruned her roses, she paused to admire the symmetry of the garden. It struck her as symbolic. Life, like her plants, required care, patience, and attention. The thorns reminded her of the hardships, the blooms of the joys she had earned. She whispered to herself, a soft but firm declaration. I am 75, and yet I am stronger than ever. My life is mine, and no one can take it from me. Margaret had transformed betrayal into empowerment, pain into wisdom, and manipulation into a lesson in strength. Her children would remember her not as someone they could take advantage of, but as a woman of unyielding dignity and resilience. And as she closed the day with the warm glow of sunset on her face, she finally felt the full weight of freedom and peace. Proof that justice, patience, and quiet intelligence could indeed prevail. She leaned back in her chair, breathing in the crisp evening air, and smiled. Life had tested her, humiliated her, and tried to diminish her. Yet here she was, victorious not through force, but through clarity, wisdom, and quiet determination. Margaret's story was no longer one of betrayal. It was one of reclamation, of triumph, and of a life finally lived on her own terms.